So here we are, live in our new webinar after a little summer break. I hope you had all a good European summer. Some interesting competition we've seen during Euros, during which we were a little bit busy instead of doing our webinars, but we're kicking it off strong again. And we think a quite on-time topic in terms of pre-season participations today. You might already be past your pre-seasons participations and your pre-season preparations, but I think still timely because on support by the ECA, we got two excellent speakers today who can guide us through the topic of pre-season preparation, and you're able to pick their brains on maybe some of the things you've encountered in the past month also. But before we start, I'd like to introduce a new member to our team, Katrien Krieger. You can see her on the screen already. Medical research specialist, just joined us in Nyon in headquarters, and she's going to help us push the medical research agenda forward and also support us in developing these webinars further and helping us to have the best experts to be presented to you. Welcome, Katrien.
Thank you, Evert, and hello, everyone. I'm very excited to be joining UEFA Medical and Anti-Doping and to hopefully see you guys on numerous occasions online for these webinars.
Wonderful. As said, today is going to be about pre-season preparations. So we got two excellent speakers. We got Matt Springham and we got Paul Balsom. There's Matt and there's Paul. We're going to do them in an opposite order today. So we're going to start with Paul, who's going to guide us through his expertise in getting the players ready for the season, and then we move to Matt, who's going to explain to us how to effectively and efficiently do pre-season screening for our players. They're going to talk back to back, and then after that we're going to have plenty of time for Q&A. Might you have any questions that pop up to Paul or either Matt? Do not hesitate to put them in the comments of our live stream. We'll be checking them, we'll be flagging them, and then afterwards in the Q&A, we will moderate your questions into the discussion we'll have. Having said that, Paul, might I put you on the spot and start with your presentation on the pre-season preparations.
Ready when you are, sir. So, tasked with the topic of talking about reconditioning during pre-season, but just very quickly, a formality, no conflicts of interest on my part. Currently a member of the UEFA Fitness Advisory Group. Just ended a 26-year stint at the Swedish FA as fitness coach for the men's team, fitness coach and sports scientist. Currently working in Mexico with Club Tigres, and that's across the men's, the women's, and the youth team, and also involved in a really exciting startup company, Photon Sports. Just wanted to start with this slide because for all of you listening, it's not pre-season, won't be the same for all of you. Some of you be working at the lead and maybe at the top of the lead, and then some of you towards the bottom end of or the lower end of the lead, and even the non-lead, and that will affect a lot in terms of facilities and staff. So at the top elite, we may be working with a staff of 20 plus people that we need to coordinate during this period. And then also duration. So in Mexico, for example, now our pre-season, we actually have 2 pre-seasons every year because we have 2 tournaments lasting between 2 and 3 weeks. So the challenges there are slightly different to maybe the conventional model in Europe, whereby we may have anything from 6, 7, 8, even 9 weeks of pre-season. And certainly in the Nordic countries, that can be even longer, spanning several months. Then climate and culture, and again, maybe not too diverse in Europe, but certainly in Mexico, we're training at 7 in the morning and 6 at night to avoid temperatures of 35 and 40 degrees. And then just reconditioning, nothing new, but just a definition, the structured process of restoring or improving players' physical fitness after a period of reduced activity. So of course, we're talking about pre-season today, but that can also be after a sickness or an injury. And then by pre-season, we mean that period of structured preparation. So when we get back together as a team before the competitive season begins, where we need to prepare our players, not only physically, of course, but mentally and tactically, ready for the demands of the upcoming season. It's a medical conference, so we'll just touch upon the injuries and the risk of injuries during pre-season. Nothing new to most of you, and no surprises. Research suggesting injury rates can be anything from 2 to 4 times higher compared to the normal season. Muscle strains, ligaments, overuse injuries, heat-related injuries, the most common, and then muscle strains accounting for about 1/3 of all injuries during pre-season. I apologize for using a reference from 2011, but I don't think the pictures changed too much since then. And of course, if there are injuries, then it's really important that we identify key injury risk factors. And that's a job of, again, at the elite level, the multidisciplinary team, but even at the lower end of the elite and the non-elite, it's really important that we start to think about what the key injury risk factors are, and then how we can develop practices and protocols to reduce the injury risk, and on an individual basis. And again, just some obvious ones, but players coming back in poor shape or in poor levels of fitness, being too ambitious and suddenly ramping up the intensity and the volume, so we're basically in no time. Again, being ambitious and not allowing adequate recovery between sessions. Still surprises me to see even professional football players coming back with new shoes, both football shoes and running shoes. And also we need to be very careful about the playing surfaces. But it's improved a lot, obviously, in the last decade. Playing surfaces are a lot better, but certainly something we need to take into account. We'll touch upon nutrition and hydration later, but obviously very important. And we've already mentioned the environmental conditions. So I've tried to identify 10 pre-season training essentials to enhance performance and reduce injury risk, and we'll go through them one at a time. I've divided into 3 parts, so the pre-season, so the pre-season. I don't like using the word off-season. I think that's outdated now. I don't think it is an off-season. I think it's a really important period. This from the last day of the previous season to the first day of the pre-season training. Talk a little bit about that, then planning for that structured period, and then actually the implementation of the reconditioning program. So this is one of my real big take-home messages to all my players, is that reconditioning starts directly after the last day of the season. And that's really important, that we ensure our players arrive back prepared for the work ahead. At the elite level, and I'm not sure if it's common practice, but certainly in the clubs I've worked with, the training facility has been manned by either a member of the medical staff or a sports scientist or a fitness coach 5 days a week, to allow players to come in and either receive treatment or work with one of the coaches. Obviously, not all players will be living locally, but we do have people on site if needed. And also, this is something which we actually brought in at Leicester City during my time at Leicester City, whereby 1 week prior to the official report back date, we did run almost like all the fitness tests that we were going to do the following week, and then players who didn't feel comfortable could then remain at the club for that week in order to make sure that they were ready to go the following week. So that was something that I've also done in some of the other clubs I've worked in, and it's worked really well. Player empowerment is key to a smooth transition. A big believer in educating our players. And it isn't rocket science, but if we have our players on board, if they're aware and they know why they're doing certain things and why it's important. It certainly makes our job a lot easier. And it's not just about coming back in shape, but it's also increasing career longevity and mental well-being, which we all know is really important in the modern game. And it also allows us to tailor the programs that we give them. So if we are giving them work to do when they're away from the club, it can be specific to their needs. They're aware why. As I said, we get a much bigger buy-in, so we can go not just give everyone the same generic program, but we can make sure that it's specific to each player's needs. What we do need to be aware of at the elite level is that more and more professional players work with a personal trainer during this period. And the take-home message with that is communication. We really do need to be aware of what the players are doing if they're working with a personal trainer, and we should have contact with that personal trainer to make sure that we know what's going on. Keep it simple. Stupid rule is again something in probably 10 or 15 years ago, really ambitious, printing notebooks for players to take home and in the minest detail everything they should do. But actually we need to keep it simple. We need to maintain player engagement, and we need to make everything that we do effective to avoid any or the risk of deconditioning. However, we do have to have a degree of individualization, so it can't be just giving out generic programs. And the key is communication, and it can be just simple exchange of text messages. But most clubs today at the elite level will have some form of data platform whereby we're having interaction with our players. So they may be logging in, they may be uploading data, we may be pushing next week's program back to them, or modifying things based on what we see they've done. And then microdosing, relatively new term, and basically I think this is one of the key things for this period, the period from the end of the previous season to when we meet the players again. And if we summarize what microdosing is, it's basically we're maintaining or even increasing the frequency of our workouts and even the intensity of our workouts, but we're decreasing the volume drastically. Should imagine most of you are familiar with microdosing, but if not, it's certainly something that I would suggest that you take a look at. But key for this period between, as I said, the end of the previous season and the start of the new season. We go straight on to the planning period. Well-structured pre-season plan is essential for aligning player preparation with club goals. Still surprised that I see a lack of planning. So it's really key that we all get together. And as I say, if we have a multidisciplinary team of 20 plus, we all have to be on board with the planning. And talking of onboarding, it's something, again, I didn't think about it probably 10 years ago, but when we are at a club and we have a new player, a new member of staff, or even a new head coach, it's really important that we make sure that they're aligned with the club's culture and expectations to facilitate that smooth transition into the team environment. And it's not just about the medical evaluations and the fitness assessments, but they really should be introduced to the club's staff, the medical staff, the fitness staff, the sports scientists. They should be aware of the training protocols. We should be aware of their history, so what they're used to at their old club, what they've done during the period before we've met them, the weeks before we met them. And then it's also very important for us to share our expectations with them. And this should be on an individual basis, and it shouldn't be rushed. It's really important that we get, as I say, all new players and staff aligned from the first days of pre-season, so that we align all our expectations. Periodization, nothing new. I've seen the pre-season divided into different phases. I don't think there's any one way of doing this, but it's really important to help us progressively increase the intensity and workload, of course, while minimizing injury risks. But the key then is the debrief. For me, is that after every phase, there is a debrief, which then will allow us to modify the coming phase. I think friendly games, the planning of friendly games is also a really big part of the planning process. And it's really important that a member of the medical staff and or fitness performance staff is involved in the planning of friendly games, because again, I've been at a club where games have been planned without the medical team or performance team being involved, and suddenly it's been chaos, and we're losing too many days on the training ground because we're either having to travel and then either prepare or recover between games. So really important that we're involved in all aspects of the planning, and we have a very clear periodization plan. I don't intend to give you a physiology 101 lecture, but actually sometimes it's really good for us just to refresh our mind, our brain on the principles of training. Because these form the basic of everything that we do if we want to maximize the training effectiveness to achieve optimal results, which of course is adaptation, and then towards the end of the pre-season period, performance. And then again, it also allows us to individualize everything for each player. Often easier said than done, but it is really key that we are able to look at each player as an individual, and not just the physical preparation, and not just making sure they're physically reconditioned, but also mentally prepared for the competitive season ahead. Integrated versus isolated approach may or may not be new to you, or I'm sure it's not new to you, but you may not have heard it called an integrated or isolated approach. And I think we can think of a continuum whereby an isolated approach is very controlled. So if we look at the diagrams in the blue, so we may be doing running drills, for example, whereby we can control if we're running in a linear, if we're running, we have changes direction, we can control speed, we can control accelerations and decelerations, and then all the way through to total chaos during the small-sided games. So the integrated approach is the holistic, whereby it's very football orientated, small-sided games, possession drills, and other game-related exercises. And the isolated approach, we're in control of what we're doing, and we're able to focus on a specific component of fitness. And it's that art of blending the two, and probably go from the first days of the reconditioning period, whereby we are using an isolated approach, and then gradually as the pre-season, the weeks go on, we introducing more and more integrated. Really interesting topic, and trying to get this and not jumping too quickly, in my opinion, into the integrated approach. And then implementation, finishing off with implementation. A successful pre-season involves navigating multiple layers for logistics, planning, and coordination. I got a big smile on my face because after 20 plus pre-seasons, I'm sure I haven't seen it all, but I've seen a lot of things, and we do need to be adaptable, and we do need to be able to improvise. And I've actually used some adjectives here. So a successful pre-season is dependent on effectively handling a range of varied, unpredictable, complex, and even volatile factors. And it can be anything from logistics to player performance metrics. And then everything needs to be aligned. So there's coordination between our coaching staff, players, and resources, and communication. I can't mention the importance of communication. If it's session debriefs or day debriefs or week debriefs or whatever, but communication is really key so that we can align everything between the different departments. And then this is also something, again, I've learned it's more effective to plan for a higher volume of training, so double or even some instances triple sessions, and then scale back if necessary, rather than starting with a lower volume, for example, single sessions, and then either adding a session or bringing them in on a day off. So scale, plan higher, and then scale back would be my advice in that aspect. A data-driven approach is crucial. I think all of us working at the elite level now have access to data, but even at the non-elite level, there is now technology that's affordable, enables us to make more informed decisions rather than sort of guessing, and we can use data to make better informed decisions. Allows us to customize programs to meet individual needs. We can track progress, and we can make adjustments based on real-time insights. And again, this is, from every pre-season I'm involved in, this is evolving. I always have a smile on face when I see this photo. It's my captain in the national team who's always on at me and wearing GPS, why we're wearing them and what is it good for and everything. But that was a picture taken several years ago. Again, I think it's all common now that players are used to playing tracking devices. And of course, it's not only the monitoring that's important, but it's the load management, that we are actually using the data to inform practice. So making interventions where we can balance the training intensity and volume with recovery, and then assuring that all players are challenged appropriately, promoting safe and effective physical adaptation. If we don't, well, even if we do have access to technology, then wellness questionnaires can also be used. And of course, they can be used on iPads, they can be used on telephones, on Google Sheets, on Microsoft Forms. So there's no costs involved if we don't have budgets. The key here, though, is that we are very, at the start of pre-season training, we educate our players as to the importance of answering these wellness questionnaires properly, so that it will inform us if the potential need for additional rest or recovery. So a big emphasis there on before we start using the questionnaires is to explain the players the importance of them and the information and feedback we can get from them. And then finally, I think I'm just about on time. Nutritional needs, again, a quick summary, a huge importance on the macro, getting a macronutrient balance right with the protein and the carbohydrates, and then trying to tailor this balance based on individual energy expenditures, which we can easier to do at the elite level. We maybe have one or even more nutritionists on board in a multidisciplinary team, but in general, getting that balance right is key. And then I shouldn't have to talk about hydration strategies. I think we all know how important that getting the fluids on board, and again, educating the players. I mean, how much fluid should be taken, when should we be taking them, and what type of fluid should we be taking, and if possible, monitoring electric balance is also key. So just to finish off, I want to keep the goalkeeper experts at UEFA happy. We do need to make sure that we pay special attention to the goalkeepers. They're easy to forget. They do have special and specific needs, so let's make sure that we plan for their pre-season as well. So there's just a summary. Hopefully I've been able to leave you something of the 10 training essentials we've gone through, and my sort of take-home message is, if everything seems to be going well, you've obviously overlooked something. And with that, I'll say thank you and pass back to you, Evan.
Thank you, Paul. Very insightful. 10 deviously simple messages with a lot of layers, I'd say. I would guess, and maybe these are 10 topics for future webinars in itself. I do think this was a very good overview of what you do on the pitch and why you do it and how it all connects to each other. For anyone listening to Paul and has any questions, please put them in the comments. We're going to have a look at them later, and we're going to throw them at Paul. I have a few here, but I'd rather hear yours. So thank you, Paul. I'm going to say goodbye for a few minutes to you, and I'm going to call Matt on the screen for now. There he is. Hi, Matt. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to joining us today. Matt's has a double role. He's a researcher at St. Mary's in England, but he's also connected to Arsenal. So a nice double role to connect us to preseason screening. So Matt, floor is yours. Screen's yours, I might say, and I'll be out for a few minutes.
Thank you very much. All right, guys. So just to start, I just want to thank everyone for listening in. It's a real privilege to be invited to be speaking to you guys today on this webinar. And just to add to that introduction, so my name's Matt. I've got a dual role. I'm associate professor at St. Mary's in strength and conditioning science, but then I'm lucky enough to have a consultancy role at Arsenal, where I serve as academy research and development coordinator. But prior to that kind of academic background, I was a sports science, strength and conditioning coach and practitioner for about 12 years full-time at various clubs in England and also with England national teams. So I've got I guess a mixed background in practice and research, which hopefully flavors this presentation a little bit. I want to start with some acknowledgements. As is the case with all of these presentations, only one person gets to present, but actually, the lion's share of this content is the result of a lot of years of a lot of work from a lot of very talented practitioners and clinicians. And I want to point to them and their contribution to this. I'm just a person delivering this presentation. So I guess where I'll add value to this is where I discuss how recent research processes and projects that we've run have informed and shaped the evolution of our testing process. But again, I don't want to take credit for what I'm about to present to you, and I want to distribute it to those guys. And in terms of conflicts, I declare none. Unfortunately, I didn't invest in Vald and some of the other companies that I might cite today. I wish I did, but I didn't, so I declare no conflicts. In terms of introduction, again, I'm given 20 minutes to talk to you about something that I could probably speak to you for 20 years about. But my aim is to provide you with a concise overview of what we do and why. It's a way. I certainly don't consider it to be the way, and I don't really want any confusion with that. Again, like when we get into the weeds of performance tests and what to test and why and what not to test and why, and those debates, it's obvious that there's multiple candidate performance tests for all of these performance qualities, and they're all limited by various constraints, and the weight of those constraints will shape what's adopted and what's not adopted in certain environments, in my experience. And indeed, your decision making in relation to what to test and why will vary based on the cohort that you're working with. Firstly, whether it's academy or senior team or the performance level, but secondly, like the cultural backgrounds of those players as well, on their prior experiences. Cultural factors including, head coach and head coaching philosophy across science and medical support departments as well will inform what you test and why, as will more obvious things like equipment, infrastructure, human resource, expertise, time probably being the most pertinent of these. And actually, what you find when you look at all of these factors is that actually it's a balancing act. There's no perfect way of doing it, and you just need to find a way of measuring the most important things as you consider them to be, in the best way that suits the environment that you're in, and that will vary. And what I'm going to present to you is a way that serves our purpose where we are at the moment. So when it comes to selecting performance tests, I tend to, when I teach students of all different levels, I tend to take this route of the, what Stephen Pliss discusses in the Moody and Jeffrey strength and conditioning text of this concept of a performance target. And in the nature of football, the performance target represents the demands of the game, or like the worst case demands of the game. The end goal for an academy setting would be like the worst case scenario match demands for Premier League or Champions League football. And we can quantify the performance target or understand that better by breaking the demands down into 3 segments. So what are the movement skill demands of match play? What are the biomechanical demands of match play? And what are the bioenergetic demands of match play? And this begins us to, I guess, triangulate what we go after and why in terms of physical development. So movement skills, like we know that things like acceleration, deceleration, change of direction, sprinting is super important from a biomechanics perspective to support those high speed and high force activities. Like rate of force development as well as peak force is important, and strength qualities are super important to supporting those match demands. And from a bioenergetic perspective, we know that it's a high intensity, intermittent, long duration sport. So the capacity to repeatedly perform high intensity efforts for sustained periods of time is important. But to understand what players need, we've got to measure things and understand where they fit in relation to those match demands or the performance target. And only once we've measured where players are, can we begin to train those different subcomponents of performance and triangulate that on the performance target aligned with the match demands, and build potentially more robust, but certainly better physically equipped players that are able to tolerate these match demands. So we tend to ask 3 main questions in that process, right? So what is the performance target? Where do players need to be? And from an academy perspective, I think it's important to ask not only, what are the current demands of academy match play and also first team match play, but also Champions League match play, for example, if there's a supplementary demand at those higher levels of European competition, but also what are the future demands? And what might those demands look like in 5 years, 10 years time? Because for some of the kids in academies, they're going to be playing at that level in those timeframes. So focusing on projecting forwards, I guess, is going to be important. And then asking the next question, once we know what that is, which we can get from literature and different modeling, but what is the current situation? So where is my player or team now? And what are their needs based on the gap between where they are now and where they need to be? And, we'd encompass that as being like the player specific needs. And then finally, once we've addressed those 2 things, we know where they need to be and we know where they are now. Can we get to this point of periodizing training and putting in place physical interventions to develop them, to prepare them for those demands? So how do I get my player there? What is the planned variation of means and methods? And we're getting into what Paul discussed in reconditioning in that section. So those questions should help refine our tests as well. But then on top of that, we've got this extra kind of scientific layer that we need to satisfy as well. So we know that physical performance tests should be valid, they should be reliable, they should certainly be relevant. I think for most environments, they should be time efficient because, football players have lots of competing demands on their time, from coaches and analysts and medical staff and so on and so forth. It needs to be a time efficient process. But equally as important to all of those things, it needs to be actionable. It needs to give us a data point that enables us to put an intervention in place to then serve an increase in physical performance potential or mitigate their injury risk. Otherwise, what's the point? Like the adage from British rowing was, does it make the boat go faster? That kind of rhetoric, that kind of notion is important here, I think. And I guess if you want to, read more about this basic construct, then, look to that, Moody and Jeffries text from, Stephen Plisk's section in that, but then also look at this review article by Paul Reed called Performance Modeling in the Journal of Strength and Conditioning Research. The Journal of Strength and Conditioning. It's a useful read to add some context to this. Then also, I guess, fortunately, where we are, we have quite a large research culture, research development and innovation culture. And the testing that we have in place at the moment has been flavored by our, previous and ongoing research in sports science and strength and conditioning principally. So, thanks to, or partly thanks to, a UEFA research grant that I was awarded a couple of years ago, we've run like a large array of studies actually looking at not only things like the retest reliability of neuromuscular performance tests like the counter movement jump and different isometric strength measures, but we've also looked at how those measures respond acutely to match play, so we understand their reliability and their typical responsiveness. And we've also looked at how match load variables as well as physical capacity measures relate to acute changes in those measures as well. So, you know, by doing that, we're giving ourselves, you know, the best chance of understanding what's important and what's relevant, and maybe what we need to keep a close eye on in our, you know, quarterly physical performance testing, but then also our more frequent daily monitoring as well, or weekly monitoring. And we've looked at, you know, we're looking and have looked at cross-season responses to some of these measures as well. And only last week we've had this paper here accepted from our group, where we looked at retest reliability for some of the tests that I'm about to speak to you about. So it is grounded in research. So, you know, if we go back to our performance target, and, you know, biomechanics being a fundamentally important paradigm of the performance target, we're going to get into testing for strength and power, and start with some of the rationale as to, you know, why we measure what I'm about to present to you. Well, you know, I guess we know that acute strength changes are commonly implicated in the etiology of injury risk in football players. You know, a recent epidemiological study showed that neuromuscular fatigue was a causal factor in about 65%, 50%, and 30% of hamstring, adductor, and quadricep injuries in Premier League under-18 academy football players. And we think, you know, by virtue of that data, that it's important to routinely measure the strength characteristics of those at-risk muscle groups. And that kind of justifies some of our unilateral muscle-specific, if you like, testing, alongside our more global performance measures of maximal strength. So this is our approach to strength and power testing. Again, like from a maximal strength perspective, we have one primary test, which is the isometric mid-thigh pull. And we adopt the protocol proposed by Paul Comfort and colleagues back in 2019. And our key performance measure there is relative peak force, which enables us to compare, you know, within and between players and cohorts. From a single limb, like a unilateral perspective, our primary measures that we're interested in are isometric posterior chain peak force using the Alan McCall method that they published a paper on back in 2015. Eccentric posterior chain peak force, which is derived from the Vald Nordboard, and then isometric adduction and abduction peak force, and hip flexion and seated plantar flexion peak force are all tests derived from the Vald force frame as well. And again, like for some of those tests, we've reported the retest reliability for our KPIs in that most recent publication. And then from a power or reactivity perspective, we've got several bilateral and unilateral tests. So we use the counter movement jump as a measure of bilateral power. We use the flight time equation as opposed to the impulse momentum equation, which I know is going to spark some debate amongst the biomechanists in the audience. But, you know, we've done that because we found far better retest reliability statistics for that method than the impulse momentum method, and even anecdotally seen some very spurious results using that equation. We do the single leg derivative of the counter movement jump for single leg power. And then we have an in-house 10-1 as opposed to a 10-5 protocol, where we look at the best jump in that series of reactive jumps to measure player reactivity. And again, those tests are done on force plates. So our method for testing for speed and change of direction, again, we can link this to the movement skills component of our performance target model, but it of course also connects to the biomechanics aspect as well. So there is, you know, kinetic and kinematic aspects to this. So for speed, we test speed across two primary distances, so 10 meters and 30 meters. Obviously 10 meters being synonymous to player acceleration and 30 meters being synonymous to player maximal running speed. Multiple GPS measures are controlled by our maximal running speed measure. And also, you know, obviously football being a repeat acceleration sport, deceleration sport, it's important to quantify acceleration capacity, right, or ability. So not only do we measure these times, but we also film this testing in the sagittal plane, as you can see there, to pick up on any important, errors according to our technical models for maximal running speed or acceleration. And that gives, I guess, a coachable point for our physical development coaches to put an intervention in place to improve movement mechanics and in return mitigate injury risk and improve on-field application. Change of direction, again, like this is, hotly debated how and if you do this. We think it's important to measure change of direction competency, and so we measure isolated single turn competency by way of looking at change of direction deficit. So we use the modified 505 change of direction deficit test, where we subtract the best 505 test completion time for the left limb and the right limb from the linear 10-meter sprint speed to show the time cost of changing direction on the left limb and the right limb. And we also film that as well to give us, again, like an extra tool in our armory, if you like, for coaching interventions. And then finally, like the final piece of that performance target model was bioenergetics. And so our testing for endurance, or our test for endurance, is the 30-15 test. We look at the VIFT measure from that test. We moved away recently from using the 1K time trial, and the most commonly used 1K time trial is a series of 100-meter shuttles, and just looking at time to completion and then dividing that by the distance to get maximal aerobic speed. We found that problematic in terms of pacing strategies, but also in terms of player groupings, and we find that there's less of an influence from those or from motivation, but also from peer pressure, if you like, when completing the 30-15 test compared to that. But we also, of course, bow down to the weight of research showing that it's a very useful tool in terms of prescribing metabolic conditioning, and of course, it's shown greater efficacy for its capacity to control exercise intensities for 30-second and 15-second intervals that you might be doing in like the middle and latter stages of pre-season, for example. So it serves as a valid and reliable and relevant performance test, because we're actually measuring high intensity intermittent running performance as opposed to steady state running, which we get in the 1K time trial, but also it's used to inform our training prescription across pre-season and reconditioning in scenarios like injury, etc. So that in a nutshell is our battery of tests that we roll out across the academy at Arsenal, and a little bit of understanding as to why and how research has informed that. But equally important, it's equally important, as well as collecting good data, to report it back in the correct manner as well, in my experience. And I think we need to present data back in a way that visually connects with players and coaches, that makes it readily interpretable and actionable. And so this is our brief approach to this. So I presented you with two player profiles, one on the left and one on the right. The player on the left is a forward. It's all anonymized data. The player on the right is a midfield player. And I'll just talk you through the brief structure of this. So there's some basic information like age, height, mass, lean mass, fat mass, and fat-free mass that comes from DEXA scans that we complete at the training ground. There's some basic injury statistics presented there as well, and then some bullet point areas to improve on from a medical injury history and performance profiling perspective. But then there's also their data presented in absolute terms for each of their key physical performance tests, their unilateral tests, their bilateral tests, as well as like metabolic tests and change of direction speed, etc. And then what we've also done there, this is nothing new really, but it's a powerful way of conveying strengths and weaknesses, is plotted their profile for each of those tests relative to their peers. So there's an instant rationale available for a coach when they ask a player to complete a specific intervention, whether that's to improve maximal strength or maximal speed, power, reactivity, endurance. It's because it's there in black and white, and they can see how they fare next to their peers. And we can further break that down to positional analyses and historic data or first team comparative data if we want to, or if we need to. But in this case, you can see, for example, that the player on the left, who's a forward, predictably is competent in aspects like power, reactivity, and acceleration and speed, whereas the player on the right, who's a central midfield player, is more competent for endurance, for example. And we can then point to specific areas to develop these guys over the long term, and that's how we apply our testing, as well as a rationale as to what we test. We then convert those summated Z scores into a total score of athleticism using, the method proposed by Anthony Turner and colleagues back in 2019, which gives a useful overall understanding of physical competency for individual players. It doesn't necessarily do much for prescribing practitioners, but it gives a good holistic overview of physicality to use to justify subsequent interventions. And on that note, that is the end of my presentation, and I'd like to thank you all for listening.
Thanks, Matt. That was an interesting insight in some research on the one hand, but also how you practically apply that at Arsenal. Paul, can you also join us back on screen, please? There he is. I want to put you both maybe a little bit on the stand, and maybe make it a little bit more practical. So we've heard your approaches, the science behind it, but in reality, we know everything could move quite swiftly in football, right? So your team just signed a new player, and the manager wants her or him, to play the first game, which is in 4 days, which is tight, but I don't think too unpractical in terms of what you can encounter. How would you manage this from your communication perspective, safety perspective, performance perspective? It's not an easy one, probably, but
Paul, do you want me to go first?
Go first, Matt. Be my guest.
Yeah, I think it's a long answer, isn't it? And I think it starts with a conversation where you look at historic data, like recently and chronically acquired training load, for example, and match load, and that will give you a basic understanding of ability to cope with a game in 4 days' time. Injury history as well, like that sort of stuff. We live in a world where there's plenty of data readily available, so those things are easy to extract and inform, a decision, as well as a conversation with the player. Oftentimes you sign players, from every corner of the world, and you have to factor in things like travel, holistic stress, those sorts of things into that decision. Would you put a player in that scenario 4 days out from a game through a battery of exhaustive physical performance tests? Probably not. Probably not. As Paul alluded to earlier, in terms of well-being and physical status, I would probably recommend that a judgment is made, an objective judgment is made on fatigue status, but not necessarily feel under any pressure to get any, at that time point, physical capacity measures. Yeah.
But Paul, anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all Matt said. I think it's also something for the multidisciplinary team. So all of us putting our heads together, and then at the end of the day, if we don't think as a team that the player is ready to play, that we're prepared to take the the fight, or whatever you want to call it, with the head coach and say, based on our professional experience, we don't recommend that this player is ready to perform. And I think things have changed now, and again, it's different from culture to culture, that that head of health and performance is able to speak to a head coach on a level that if we don't, as a multidisciplinary team, feel that the player's ready, that we're prepared to say that.
Thanks. Back to Matt. There was one question in the comments, actually after Paul, but I think you halfly answered it. The importance of a fit light to evaluate speed reaction in preseason. But I think the most important bit of the question is in the end. Are there any differences between the ages and genders when you use such measures in practice? But what are your experiences in Arsenal with that?
Sorry, what measures? I missed that.
This specific question was around fit light to evaluate speed in preseason. But maybe you can say something about different uses of screening between age groups and genders at Arsenal, or is it a one-size-fits-all approach that you're employing?
So you're going to have to excuse me. I'm unfamiliar with what fit light is. I'm not sure I mentioned it on that. That might be a typo.
No, you said something about speed and measuring speed, sprinting speed, and all these things. The question is, I think, more interesting at the end, where if there are any differences in evaluating any preseason characteristics or outcomes or measures between different ages, different genders. Or is there more of a universal approach across the entire club?
Yeah, I've just pulled the question up here. So it says about the importance of evaluating speed reaction, and I wonder if if Oscar, who wrote that question, is talking about the importance of like perception reaction, that sort of process. I could be wrong, so please retype the question if I'm off task. We don't measure that, so we let players self-select when they start those sprint efforts for timing, right? So we give them a window to go in, and they go, and we don't ask them to react to a stimulus. If the question is perception and reaction important, then absolutely, but it's just super hard to measure using a relevant method, right? We talk about fast movers and fast thinkers, don't we? And the best players are fast movers and fast thinkers. They make the right decision very quickly. It's just very hard to measure.
And then maybe going into the different ways of doing preseason assessments and screenings. I could assume that in the academy it's probably different than the first team. In the women's team, it's probably different than in the men's team. Paul, can you say something about the different approaches between different subdivisions within a club?
Well, certainly in Tigers, we're trying to align as much as we can, certainly between the men's senior and the women's senior, that there's actually, for the basics, no reason to be any difference at all. We share equipment whenever we can. We have our reporting is the same, so we use workflows that we put data into our data platform, and we get out something similar to what Matt has shown us. So aligning the men's and senior, and then slightly different for us with the academy because our academy is off-site. But again, I think aligning methodologies and testing procedures as much as we can is important, because then we can follow our players all the way through from the academies up to the senior teams.
And then during off season, is there any equipment that you send your players home with or away with, so you can keep in touch during the off season, or at least you have some information of what they did during the off season that helps you to prepare again?
I mean, it's quite common for players now to either wear the Aura ring or a Whoop or something similar, and some will allow us access to their data quite freely because they feel it's not a big brother, it's the opposite, we're supporting them. But that's about it. On some special players, we may provide them with things, but as I say, a lot of them now have their own personal trainer, and a lot of them will have gyms at home as well, so they have full access to to their own equipment. I am a big fan of trying to see them once or twice during that period back at the training ground. But again, that's easier said than done with international players, etc., etc. But at least they know they're welcome to report back at any time, and there will be somebody there to take care of them.
Yeah.
And then we mustn't forget the importance of the subjective well-being questionnaires if they're done properly. I think that can tell us a lot as well.
Yeah. There's another question. I'll throw this one at you again, Matt. Again from Oscar, about glucose monitoring. There is some ample evidence, though, about sensors that we might be able to use. They might tell us a little bit about nutritional support or nutritional status of players. Are you aware of any of that, and could you make recommendations based on your knowledge?
I think, look, I'm aware of these sensors. I'm unaware of their application for continuous monitoring in football players. And being honest, it's probably a question more aligned for a sports nutritionist than it is for me. I think, from a monitoring perspective, like, what would I be more interested in if my concern is fatigue? I think neuromuscular status. I'd be taking frequent neuromuscular status measures. So whether that's through jump isometric strength test measures, we've looked at the responsiveness of those to heavy training and match loads and shown good efficacy. I'd be interested in changes to hormonal and immune status as well, because that will influence the capacity to tolerate stress, and point towards the adaptive status of players. So I know that's a bit off track from the question, but it probably points towards some of the monitoring that I would be thinking about, and I certainly would be interested in learning about their application in this scenario. The continuous glucose monitoring. I think it's probably more relevant for endurance sport than it is for high-intensity intermittent sport. But again, I'm not a sports nutritionist, so I wouldn't want to commit to a firm response. Yeah,
I understand that. Paul, you mentioned a debrief in your presentation. You both also mentioned some subjectivity in there, but most of the measures we're talking about right now in the Q&A also are kind of objective measures. When we go to the debrief and when we go to all the information you get from other members of the team, most importantly, probably the player, what is your approach to that? How valuable are these subjective inputs that you probably hear through the grapevine or via?
I mean, we all know that in a team of 25 or 30 players, we'll probably take more notice of certain players than others, and it's getting to know the player. But it's really coming back to education and player empowerment, that they understand that what they're telling us is important for us, so we can modify training load, volume, intensity appropriately. So once they understand that, and it's nothing that happens overnight, it is a long period, but I assume, and Matt may jump in, that if we're able to do that from the early ages in the academy, so as they come up through the academy, it's similar questions, probably or no. The biggest thing for me is that we need to act on this information. So, for example, what players say is that, why am I telling you I'm tired and you're not doing anything about it? Or why am I telling you I've got muscle soreness and I see nothing change? So that's what I hear all the time. Well, I hopefully don't hear it too often, because, especially in the national team, as soon as we do get a red flag, then our doctor's in contact with them immediately. So following up on the wellness questionnaires and where interventions need to be made is making sure they are made. I think that would be for me to summarize.
Yeah. So given time, Matt, I'll give you the floor first, or the screen first, for my last question. The people online are medical doctors, probably also physical therapists associated with clubs. What would you, from your roles within the club, expect from the medical staff to share with you, or to provide you with, so you can do your job better and they can do theirs better? Maybe in a brief sentence.
Yeah, I just want to touch on that last point around subjective measures, because I would certainly be collecting that data for two primary reasons. Firstly, we know from the likes of Robin Thorpe's research at Man United that several of those measures on those Likert type scales are sensitive to changes in high speed running distances. And secondly, because in our research a couple of years ago in Premier League football players, we showed that they relate to changes in immunological and hormonal status as well, right? So there's good, a good rationale for their implementation. In terms of what I mean, expect is a bit of a strong word, isn't it? I would broadly answer that question by saying anything that connects to injury risk or might limit performance would be of interest to me. There are health conditions that I would not need to know about, and there are things that might limit physical capacity and things that might limit stress tolerance that I would want to understand if I was in a coaching type role. And this is the art of running a multidisciplinary team, isn't it? Where relevant information is shared in the correct way, the right volume of the right information, and that's what you observe in good teams. So that is a bit of a quick response, but it's probably summates it quite well.
Anything to add to that, Paul, or do you agree with Matt there?
No, completely agree. In fact, it's quite interesting that sort of the role of the medical doctor. I don't think, or we all know this, doctors are very different in what they can offer. So we have sort of very hands-on doctors who will be on the grass and be involved in everything, to more doctors who sort of keep on the shirt and tie and involved in the sort of clinical, more the clinical decisions. So no, I just really again agree with all Matt said there.
Wonderful. Of course, I asked that question also because our next webinar in 4 weeks, end of September, is about the multidisciplinary team. We got two speakers from the medical side who manage medical teams within professional clubs, and they're going to share their experiences, how to navigate a multidisciplinary team and how to communicate effectively and how they set it up. So that's, I think, a perfect last question and last comments from your ends to close today. So before everybody logs off, I'd like to thank you both for your input and your talks. Very insightful, helpful. Some interesting answers to maybe some difficult questions we posed. Thank you. And also, before people log off, we would like to plug the medical symposium that we will organize around Women's Euros in 2025 in Lugano, February 4 to 6. Information will be added to our website soon. There is some rudimentary information already available if you go to www.uefa.com and look for Medical Symposium. An update and registration will follow in the next couple of weeks. The program is attuned not only to medical doctors, also to physical therapists. And for 3 days, we will share with international experts within football and also other specialized topics for you, some practical pearls and insights. So stay tuned for that. And for now, thank you for all your input. Thank you for sharing. Thank you for being online, and see you end of September.